Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open to be a part of the program. It is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Evans. Welcome in, sir.
Are you enjoying the fall, Noah?
I am very much enjoying the fall. It's actually one of my favorite times of the year. I think it's absolutely gorgeous outside. Again, if you'd like to be a part of the program, join us 855-450-NOAH. We'd love to take your calls, answer your questions, and walk through your technical challenges. You're on Ask Noah. Good evening.
Hey, how's it going? Question for you. If you were going to, say you had your house down to bare studs and you were going to redo your lighting system, would you still go with Lutron?
I would. Before I get that too far down this hole, Steve, you did this actually more recently than I did in your own home. What did you land on and why?
So I decided to go with the Z-Wave stuff. So I'm running a mix of GE and Brighton stuff and some other Z-Wave type stuff, depending on what I ended up needing. Part of that was just because I found the Lutron stuff to be expensive, and I honestly at the time wasn't really sure what the state of Lutron was in terms of being able to be disconnected, and it was an unknown quantity. Honestly, I didn't ask Noah too much about it, so I guess that's my failing.
So here's what I would tell you. I would tell you that Z-Wave they've built a reliable, self-sustainable system, no doubt about it. But the way that I look at automation, I look at integration and the controller as kind of the glue that brings everything together. So my position the way I've kind of approached this is Z-Wave seems like a solid, open, reliable way for geeks to put automation into their own home. Z-Wave is not designed, so far as I can tell, and it's not ideal for professional installation in which the end user has no ability to troubleshoot or maintain. If they're going to change something, they're going through an installer to do that. It's just not built that way. And so I look at, in a Z-Wave system, what is the Z-Wave system? What is the light controller? The thing that if the controller goes down, that everything else continues to function. And with Z-Wave, it's all in one. So Home Assistant is the automation integration controller that ties all of the systems together. It's also the light system. And so when I interview professional integrators and I ask them, none of them specifically seek out Z-Wave. They're all integrating existing devices. And so the reason that I chose Lutron Radio Raw and where I would still steer you that direction is it's just dead reliable. Raw 2 is a pro-level solution that's robust and stable, and it achieves that by operating on a dedicated 434 megahertz spectrum. So they go to the FCC, they license that spectrum, and they say, hey, we are going to operate in the spectrum and nobody else is allowed to do that. And if anybody does cause interference, that's a violation of Part 97 in the FCC code, and then those companies get shut down. So Lutron's technology at this point, I think, is 15 years old, so it's extraordinarily mature. It's never seen a wireless communication. I've been installing them and using them for 15 plus years and just never had a problem. On top of that, Raw 2 is specifically designed to be integrated into other automation systems. So when you want to have the controller that ties the HVAC to the access control, to the Lutron, to all of those things, that it works with that model just fine. It's just if that central integrator or that controller falls apart, the lights are still working. You still have light automation control.
So I suppose for my part, I probably would consider Lutron in the future. So Z-Wave, unlike Zigbee, is not an open protocol. So from the perspective of like the pure open sourcey type idea, there's no real difference between Lutron and Z-Wave from that perspective, as far as I understand. Would you agree with that, Noah?
I think so. I think the downside with Lutron from an open source side is Z-Wave is an agreed upon protocol, and so there's many different manufacturers that are going to build light switches so you can get very expensive light switches, you can get very budget light switches, but they all function around an interoperable standard. The only person making Lutron dimmers is Lutron. And so that's a potential problem.
So, I mean, with that in mind, if you're comfortable buying into an ecosystem, I wouldn't have any objection. Not that you specifically asked me, but just on reflection, I wouldn't have any specific objection to doing Lutron just because it's not like you're trading an open for a closed protocol. The only thing that I would say I'll put defense in air quotes, is that, open Z-Wave and related stuff has been picked up by the Home Assistant Foundation. And so that is going to just continue to get better. So if you're looking for an ecosystem that multiple manufacturers contribute to and is going to continue to be supported by Home Assistant, if that's what you're into, then Z-Wave makes a lot of sense because they're on the payroll. Now, if that's not a part of the consideration, there's no real downside of picking Lutron over Z-Wave stuff.
Well, I would like it to work with Home Assistant. That's down the road though. I mean, there is a Lutron integration though.
There is, yes.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
If say you got the walls all stripped down, is there any advantage to? Are there any switches that are worth running like a control wire to, or is wireless the way to go?
Great question. I would so if you look in almost all industrial control applications, almost all of them, they have central wiring panels where they run effectively a bunch of 18 gauge 2 conductor to all of these DIN boxes, and then everything is just a DIN module, and then they decide what they're going to send out what. And so if if they have a switching infrastructure and they say, hey, in a factory it's not that simple, right? The automation gets a little more complex because it can't just be when somebody hits the master kill switch, shut everything off. It doesn't work like that because you have to shut down the processing plant or whatever, so that if somebody's tie is caught or whatever it is. But you also the machine is hot, so you potentially just can't sit there if if it's a company that does baking, right? And so you have to kick on the exhaust fans. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen kind of simultaneously, and that's all you can't afford for it to fail. You can't afford for it to suffer from, the computer crashed, so this thing didn't work. And so all of those industrial applications are all hardwired things so that when a control signal is sent to a thing, the other thing receives it. The way that you would achieve that in a residential home without busting the bank and without having to fork out for this stupid level expensive automation stuff is you would run something like Cat 6. Cat 6 and Romex can be in a box as long as the Cat 6 is being used to control the device inside of the box. Most of the time, most electricians and electrical code will dictate that low volt and high volt have to be separate. The only time that you are allowed to cross that barrier is if the control wire, the low volt control wire, is controlling the load that is running AC, then they can share a box. And so if I were you, if it were my house and my walls were open, I'd run all of the switching wires to the locations, and then I would run drops of Cat 6 into those same locations. So if you ever get the opportunity to either use a dimmer that has, a lot of times they'll do like a four conductor, basically a serial bus that kind of daisy chains everything together. That's one really popular control mechanism. And then of course the newer one is IP. And so you plug these little things in and you plug an IP power over Ethernet kind of a thing in, and it will talk on the network and get an IP address.
Any recommendations for switches that use Cat 6 that can speak Home Assistant?
I mean, so I would start with Shelly, right? If you're comfortable with it, the thing about Shelly's are the Pro line has both wired Ethernet, and they'll do either a single DIN unit that will dim one light, or they've got the Shelly 4 Pro, which will switch, doesn't dim, but switches 4 different loads. And so in that scenario, call me back in 12 weeks and ask me if this works out. But we're doing one of our first professional installs with Shelly's, and the way that we've chosen to do that is do it inside of one central place and then switch those loads back out. So all of the Shelly's will sit inside of a DIN panel, inside of a closet, and then it will switch the loads for that area of the house. And then we'll go to a different area of the house and we'll put a DIN panel in there and Shelly's. And so the electrician is dropping all of the electrical wires into these DIN panels, and we're going to put Shelly's, and the control surface will actually be an Orbit panel from our friend down at Orbit Panels. And so that will actually be the control surface that the people interface with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good info.
So that's potentially where I would start. And then the only thing I'll add to that is, in some ways, the Orbit panel Shelly combination is maybe a step above the Lutron system from the standpoint that you get the interoperability because the Orbit panel running BitFocus Companion can directly talk to the Shelly. You don't have to have Home Assistant in there, but you get all of the fancy integration from Home Assistant and the ability to bring all those other systems in. So it has that same working model. Where I would say it potentially has a leg up, and again, the drill is out and we'll be back in about 12 weeks when we see how well it works, is with the Shellys, it's a hardwired network connection. So now the Orbit panel is hardwired and the Shelly is hardwired, whereas even with the Lutron system, you're still operating over radio waves. And so it's technically against FCC regulations to cause harmful interference to a primary user of a band, which Lutron is of that specific frequency. But in the end, what's to stop somebody from making a thing or making something that creates a spurious emission? Maybe they don't even know that they're causing harmful interference. And then, so anyway, so it still has the potential for interference, though I've not experienced it. Is that helpful to you?
Yes.
Steve, anything to add before we let him go?
Nope, just interested in listening to your experiences as it goes.
Yeah, call us back. Let us know. We would love to hear from you. Steve, with that, are you ready to get into some written feedback?
Let's do it.
Our first email comes in tonight from John. John writes in and says, "Hey, Noah and Steve, there's an issue that I would appreciate your assistance with, affecting both my laptop and my wife's. They both run Fedora Linux 40. I use the command line Linus security tool to carry out audits and help me harden the system on both laptops. The Linus tool has flagged the following recently," and then he gives the error. "The journal block device driver is not loaded since boot time. You've not been using any file systems with journaling. Alternatively, a reason could be that the driver is blacklisted. I'd appreciate if you could assist me with this. I'm looking forward to hearing you. Thanks, and best regards, John." So, Steve, what does that error mean, and what should he do about it?
So I kind of went spelunking around, and there's a few different causes for this if it's legitimate. So number one is you're using a file system that doesn't have journaling. Probably not likely in this case. Similarly related to this, you might have a file system that the tool itself doesn't understand. Now, if it's something more popular like ZFS, it's probably not going to choke on that. But let's say that you were running some of the more fancy ones like Bcachefs or something like that. You didn't say, I'm going to assume you're just running the run-of-the-mill, but this error is often tripped by a file system that is not supported by the tool, and therefore it thinks it's not journaling. However, I did go trolling around on their GitHub, and I did find that very recently, as in like up to an hour before the show, the developer was still responding into the thread saying like users had identified down to the commit which commit of this tool was actually causing the problem. So I expect that this will resolve itself if you are running into the bug that is documented on the GitHub page.
Our second email comes in from Jeremy. Jeremy writes in and says, "Hey, Noah and Steve, I'm looking for a camera with audio recording. I came across the Axis Q9307 LV Dome camera. Will this work with any open source recording software? Would you have any specific recommendations for outdoor cameras that can record both audio and video? Also, which software should I consider for an NVR? Thanks, Jeremy." So, okay, so let's start with the easy ones. The easy ones are, as far as will this camera work with any, the Axis all Axis cameras work with RTSP, RTMP media. So it will work with everything from, you could use it with FFmpeg. You literally could open FFmpeg and grab a video stream from the Axis camera and spit it out into a video file, and it would just dump into whatever computer box you want a video file of the video stream. So it'll work with anything. OBS. As for specific software, Steve, how's your NVR situation coming along?
So we're still using Frigate, and generally the experience has been really good. And I say generally because there's a caveat where sometimes you go to, so we have a a dashboard that we put it on. The dashboard works every time. So 6 or 7 cameras load up on the dashboard and you can see them in kind of like a 3x3 grid or whatever. When you go to click on them, the user experience is inconsistent. Sometimes it pops up like immediately, and sometimes I hear my wife sighing in frustration as she's clicked the refresh button 2 or 3 times. I don't know what's up with that. But in terms of the actual functionality of the NVR, she loves the fact that she can scrub the timeline and go and find things. The way that we have it in integrated with Home Assistant has been really good from the perspective of like Home Assistant puts a marker in the NVR when we have certain conditions that trigger to say, hey, there's an actual event. So we're recording all the time from some of the things, and Home Assistant is the one telling the camera, this is an event that we care about. And that has been really useful as well. So we really like Frigate from that perspective. Aside from that one little intermittent thing where a user may click on a thumbnail to make it the full screen version, and it taking a while or having to refresh. I don't know what's up with that. I don't know if that's too much strain on the camera or what that possibly could be, but Frigate gets a thumbs up still.
So I would echo Steve's comments on, well, first of all, I would give Steve all the latitude in the world from the standpoint that that's what he's using on a day-to-day basis. I would take his word for it, not mine. In my experience, what I have seen is Frigate is absolutely there, and in most cases exceeds what the average home user is going to expect. I think with their UI design, it has become functional for most businesses. Like if you have a business, and the vast majority of business owners, they want to open their phone, they want to open an app, they want to tap on the camera and see the feed, done. Frigate checks the box. Open the phone, open the app, go back to a specific time and see and filter by specific camera, boom, Frigate checks the box. So I think we're there. I just don't think it has had enough time to bake that I would stick it into a business and say, here, rely on this thing. So at the moment, we are still installing Synology surveillance stations, which are great. You buy them once, you put in the surveillance license key, and then you own that thing, and you can image the drive. So even if the company went away, you'd still be able to use their product. But as I've told every person that works for my company and will continue to do so, if it's not open source, it's a placeholder until the open source thing can move in, and that's the thing that we can sell and support. And so we're actively watching Frigate, and I have absolutely, I've done everything from massive installs where we've covered malls and daycare centers and large areas with lots of cameras, all the way down to people. There have been some people that have literally laughed when we give them the price, and they're like, yeah, I just don't have anywhere near that budget for cameras. And so Frigate, and actually even before Frigate, there were some other open source tools that were out there that were good. They didn't quite have the UI appeal that Frigate does. But I would start with Frigate, and if it meets your needs, I would stay there. If you need something with more things, so an example of where Frigate might hit a limit is, and where Synology might be appropriate, is once you start getting into hundreds of cameras, you need to be able to balance that load out. But the problem then becomes you don't want to have to tell employees like, hey, when you want to see these cameras, log into this one. When you want to see those cameras, log into that one. And these cameras over here, log into that. It would just become obnoxious. And so Synology has the ability to gang things together so that all of the processing will be handled on their little respective stations, but the user has one app to go to, one thing. None of it's cloud-based. All of it's on-premise, supports local encryption, doesn't require the internet, doesn't require the cloud, those sorts of things. But regardless of what NVR solution you go to, any RTSP or RTMP camera, what you're looking for is ONVF compliant. If they comply to that standards, it's going to work with the vast majority of recording softwares out there. Our third email comes in from Joe. Joe writes in and says, hello, sorry to hear about the Nextcloud issues. For PHP FPM's spike, it might be a versioning issue with that in Nextcloud. The latest Nextcloud is up to PHP 8.3, but there was a recent 8.2, so that might be better. Also, check if the Talk app is enabled, and if you're using it, if not, you probably best disable Talk. There was recently the change to mark the apps in Nextcloud that are supported and better tested. You may want to check that those are the active apps. Last, consider a browser cache. If all is the same after a reinstall, sometimes the cached assets of Nextcloud are no longer valid after an upgrade, especially from 27 to 28. That was a major Verge change to the project. Good luck, Joe. So, Steve, does any of that sound like that? First of all, let me ask you this. As an experienced troubleshooter yourself, did any of that occur to you, and did you try any of that? And then my second follow-up question is any of that helpful to you?
So I definitely did the browser cache thing. That is definitely not the issue because it's not based on a browser. Doesn't matter if you try a completely unconnected device and hitting it up. It's just dead in the water. It's not a browser cache. I didn't know about the Nextcloud Talk suggestion, so I did go ahead and do that. And I also disabled a few things that were enabled by default that I know that I'm not using. So we'll see. I'm not sure that I'm ready to remove my cron job that reboots the machine because it's kept us stable and nobody has complained, as I didn't think they would, because the VM takes 5 seconds at most to reboot and come back online. So it's not, 5 seconds at midnight isn't really a big deal. But I really did appreciate the feedback specifically, and I did go looking at a couple of those things.
Very good. We will look at Charlie next. Charlie writes in and says, good day. The wider community was upset by some recent decisions taken by the Godot project. The open source community has offered a solution, Reddit Engine. The community fork without the corporate funding. It's already under attack, smears, and abuse for refusing to go along with the corporate woke trend. Steve, thoughts?
So there was some concern about the direction that the Godot project had come out with in terms of what their community guidelines were and how they were going to interact with companies that wanted to do business with them. And so from reading Charlie's email and the links and stuff like that, the Redo engine came as a fork and basically said, you know what? We're not going to take any outside influence. Like, this is 100% a community-driven project now. And so they forked the Godot engine. I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not the community can lift such a large thing as the Godot project, because it's pretty weighty. It is not a small thing for people to be able to shift into. Could happen. We've seen things like we saw Tenacity come out of Audacity and a few other things where the fork has been mildly successful, although I think branding is going to be a problem. Like the idea that, for example, I have a friend who's he doesn't really follow the computer world very much, but he's very much into tinkering around with games and he likes to do writing and stuff like that. And so he's heard of the Godot engine, but would not have heard of this thing, and also wouldn't know or care necessarily to go find a fork, or wouldn't even know about the decisions that were made. And so it might appeal to a subset of users, and we'll see how long a community like that can go, because part of this is going to be reactionary. I've been there myself, right? But at some point, life takes over and you decide whether or not the amount of lift that you're taking on in order to hold whatever ideals that you're championing is worth it, right? You might feel strongly, and one other person, but like the Godot engine is huge, and will you get enough people that feel as strongly as you do in order to sustain this in the long term? I guess that's to be seen.
Absolutely.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of October 13th, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. OpenSUSE Leap Micro 6.0 has been released, and the development version of Leap.16 has started. Canonical has announced the availability of Ubuntu 24.10. Tails 6.8 and a quick 6.8.1 patch are now out. OpenBSD 7.6 is available for download. KDE has turned 28, and the KDE team has announced the release of KDE Framework 6.7. As well, KDE Plasma 6.2 is now available. The Linux kernel team has announced the EOL of the Linux 6.10 kernel to be November 14th, 2024. The Qt group has announced the release of Qt 6.8 LTS. Python has released version 3.13. RPM 4.20 is now available. The Wayland team has released Wayland Protocols 1.38. DistroBox 1.8 is out. Inkscape 1.4 has been released. OpenTV has released version 1.0. OpenRaiser 3.9 is now available and supports a bunch of new devices on Linux. In open source AI news, There's a new high-quality AI video generator called Pyramid Flow that has launched, and it's fully open source. NVIDIA has unveiled NVLM 1.0, an open source LLM with improved text and vision capabilities. And lastly, in open source security news, the open source development ecosystem has experienced a significant rise in malicious software components, putting enterprises on high alert for software supply chain attacks. Sonatype's new annual State of Software Supply Chain report says that new malicious components account for over 70% of the around 700,000 malware packages that they track. The company has tracked over 500,000 new malicious packages since November 2023 across the popular Java, JavaScript, Python, and .NET packages registries.
Steve, did you ever go to a client in which you arrived on site and they showed you to what was formerly a broom closet or, like a back room that was attached to a mechanical room? And they're like, some guy who, had nothing to do with IT was like, yeah, that seems like the great place to put the IT room. I think we should put a patch panel right there and just put all IT nerd stuff right there in that little room. And then you get done and it's like, okay, well, that made sense when there was nothing in the room. It makes less sense when there's a 2-post rack in the room. It made less sense yet when a few months later they put a 4-post server rack in the room, and now there's the room for a Steve or a Noah's. We're down to we're measuring inches. You ever been something like that?
I absolutely have. I'm picturing one room that if I could describe it, you could think about if anybody's ever seen any of those comedies like Better Off Ted or whatever, where they've got the one small room and you open the door and it bangs into the desk and you think, how did they get the desk in there? This room had 2 of those desks in it, and you think they mounted everything on the wall because of that, and you think, how did you get it in there, and why did you think this was a good idea?
So I have been there too. Now here's the thing: you have, it's on permanent loan for the time being. My little stool that I take with is my little travel stool. It's $20 thing on Amazon. It's God's gift to. I just want to rest my body weight on something at the moment, and there isn't enough room to fit a chair or whatever it is in there. And so that has saved me. And I have recently come across a new little thing, and this thing is made by a company called Instand. Now, Instand makes portable tripod-style folding laptop stands. I've used many tripod-style laptop stands. This one is unique for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Model CR3 adjusts from 19 inches to 41 inches. So you can get basically a full... Now, I'm vertically challenged. Steve is not vertically challenged, so your mileage may vary here. But on 41 inches high, that is a standing desk height for me. And so if I stand at it, this little thing gives me an 11 by 13 inch tray that holds my 13 inch laptop perfectly. They make a little accessory that hangs off the side so you can hang a trackball or whatever your mouse of choice is, but it takes mere seconds to set up. You basically screw the very top platform on to the little tripod legs, and then the tripod legs fold from an upward, almost like an umbrella position, all the way down 180 degrees until they're pointing down. And then the tripod becomes, you can set it up to have a very wide base or a very narrow base, depending on if you're looking for stability or height. The tripod then folds down to the point that it is it's like a small umbrella and fits in most laptop cases, and folds down to 2 inches by 18.5 inches and weighs just under 26 ounces. So there's a couple of things about this that make it really practical and useful for me. Number one, I can take it on an airline. Number two, it's not, sometimes there are really cool things, but they're so big or cumbersome or difficult, or you have to know so far ahead of time that they don't end up being practical. The thing about both my little travel stool and this device called the Instand CR3 is I don't really have to think about it. It can ride in my trunk, and when I need it, I just run out and grab it, or I can take it in, and even if I don't use it, I just carry a little tiny bag next to me. The other thing, some of you that have more of a personal connection with me know that about within the last year, I struggled with some injuries to my neck from straining forward looking at computer monitors. And so since that time, I've become very conscious of ergonomics and making sure that I'm holding my head up properly. But that means that I need to be able to get the laptop up to a height to where I can work. Now, my previous answer to this was just Thunderbolt docks, right? And to a degree that works. And I have a little portable system that I take with me when I can set it up. And so when I'm in a full-on office environment, that's great. That works fine. When I'm in the broom closet, which is more often than I'd like to be in the broom closet, it turns out you need a small little portable laptop stand. So the things that make me a little nervous about it, the first thing that makes me nervous about it is the most of the construction is metal, but the supports that go from the outward-facing legs to the center support shaft are plastic. Additionally, the compression fitting used to adjust the height is plastic. So those things made me a little nervous. But then I looked at their warranty. Here's what their warranty says straight from their site. Lifetime warranty. Lifetime warranty on the tripod is against manufacturer's defects when used in non-commercial applications. It will be cheerfully repaired or replaced at our option when returned to us for inspection, along with a copy of the original sales receipt. Not included in this warranty is normal wear and tear or damage as the result of abuse. Accessory items are not included. The customer must contact us in advance to receive instructions and return an RMA. So there's a couple things that stand out to me on that lifetime warranty. So the first is they want the option to repair or replace it. As a person who's looking for sustainability, I like that. I actually like the fact that we're not with the Harbor Freight model. It broke, throw it away, come buy a new one. Or even it broke and we'll send you a new one for free. It's send it to us. We designed that thing to be repairable. And indeed, if you look, even the plastic pieces are replaceable. So that I like. The second thing I like, they say it will be cheerfully repaired or replaced at their option. They don't say we'll make a determination if we're going to do anything for you at all. They say that we're going to cheerfully help you either by sending you a new one if it just can't be fixed, or if it can be fixed, we'll fix it and then we'll send it back to you. We'll look at it because we designed the thing, so we know what can be repaired and what can. That seems reasonable to me. But then the bigger thing is, then they excuse themselves from the morons of the world, right? If you use it in a commercial application and you're not setting a laptop and giving a presentation off of it or working inside of a broom closet, but instead, it's the rack that Bubba sat down on because he leaned against it and it smashed into 5 pieces. Like, that's not a manufacturer's fault. That's not their fault. So they excuse themselves on what I would consider to be reasonable things, and then back that preface with, we'll be happy to come alongside you and fix this thing for you because we believe in our product. So that's the good sides of it. Here's the thing I don't like about it. Again, those plastic feet. So there's that part, plastic support things. The other thing is it's frightfully expensive for what it is. So it is $120 some, I think, for their sit-stand model, the CR3 sit-stand model. And so what I would tell you is if you are a traveling IT person and you are working a lot off of a laptop, or if you're a professional speaker and you're presenting a lot off of a laptop and that involves flying, it might very well be worth the money to you to have something like this. It is without a doubt the lightest, best built laptop stand I've ever come across. Looks like they're usually $130. They're actually on sale right now for $119. But when I started pricing it out, and originally I was like, man, that's too expensive. I'm not going to do it. Then I looked at what we paid for our Canon laptop stands that mount to a music stand, and that's like in a music application when places are performing. And some of them, like the articulating one from K&M, is $209. Their tripod version is $159. And oh, by the way, it doesn't collapse down to nearly the size that this guy does. The cheapest one K&M makes is $119. So when you put that into perspective, I think it's actually a really fair price for what the device is. And I got to tell you, I had a friend of mine who purchased one. And I said, you bought one of those, because I knew about it. I was aware of it, but I never really was comfortable enough to fork up the money. And so I've had it now, I think, a week and a half. And I got to tell you, it in some ways has changed my life. Like the ability to just, when I'm having a conversation with somebody, even when there is a desk, if I'm sitting at the desk and somebody comes up and I can take the laptop and set it on the table and I'm facing that person, it just, the body language is different. The interaction with people is different. The ability to just walk up to my laptop and have it accessible to me while I'm standing, whether it's the middle of a big room. That's the other thing. I would find myself kneeling down and doing the thing where you balance it on one knee. And as long as you got both palms on there, you got enough counter tension that you can do the dance and hold the laptop up. So you can do all that. It's fine. It works. I've done it for 15 years, but this just makes it nicer. It makes it nicer. So it's called the Instand, INSTAND. You can learn more at instand.com, the CR3. Steve, I assume with your evolving and growing role at Red Hat, I assume that you're not doing a whole lot of at client sites now. Steve does a lot of his stuff from the remote office, so to speak.
Well, I do stuff at the client for sure, but not at the same level that you do, right? So if I have to, they generally sit me in a conference room or at a desk somewhere, and if I'm up and wandering around, I usually leave my laptop because it's time to have some level of communication, right? So I'm either giving a presentation or I'm having a conversation. And so I don't usually need to bring my laptop around with me like that.
No, that makes sense. It would definitely have to be a thing that you would want, like, again, it's kind of a niche product for a niche people, but here's why I wanted to draw some attention to it. There are some products, the other one, it's not really tech related, but it's made by a company called Traveler Guitar. And they are a very esoteric, unique company that makes a foldable guitar. And I bought their Escape, which is their basically acoustic version of their guitar. I tried buying a cheaper alternative, and it was a disaster. And then I spent the money and bought the actual Escape Mark III, I think it was, from Traveler Guitar. And it was the first time I was able to go and take my hobby with me when I was at a hotel or when I was outside. And ever since then, I've had an eye out for, here are really cool things that have very niche things. So they're maybe a little pricey, but they might be really, really worth it if you're a person that's in that situation. When I came across the CR3, the more time I spend on it, the more I'm convinced, like, if you're an IT nerd and you're working off of a laptop and you don't have a dedicated desk, man, that's definitely something you'll want to consider. So check it out. We'll have a link for you in the show notes, podcast.asknoahshow.com. A year from now, on October 14th, 2025, Windows 10 will drop out of support. Some users will be able to continue receiving security updates for a fee, while others are using the long-term service challenge, or LTSC editions. They have a little bit more time. Windows 10 IoT Enterprise LTSC support will expire on January 13th of 2032, while Windows 10 Enterprise LTSC runs till January 9th, 2029. But for the rest, just 365 days until Microsoft halts the updates. So Steve, this is huge. It's not huge as in like it's something that we didn't see coming or that we did, but why it's huge is with the change from Windows 10 to Windows 11, Microsoft requires a TPM chip on the computer, which means that computers past a certain age old are no longer eligible to run Windows 11. And so on the date of October 14th, 2025, if you have not purchased a system that has one of these hardware chips in it, you will not be able to upgrade to Windows 11. And when Microsoft discontinues support for Windows 10, your computer will become, over time, more and more susceptible to threats. So this is a huge deal. Steve Hackshaw, the Group Director for Sustainability Growth and Circular Computing, called it the biggest Control-Alt-Delete in history. Other organizations like the Public Interest Research Group have called on Microsoft to expand the support for Windows 10 to prevent all these devices all of a sudden being rendered ineligible for upgrades, and so they're going to wind up in the landfill. The thing that bothers me is that the focus here is not on the user. It's not on what is in the user's best interest. They're not coming alongside the user and saying, hey, this is going to be really good for you. This is going to really help you. What they're doing is saying, hey, we want you to move off of this version of Windows that was largely working for you and your organization that you were happy with into this new operating system, which doesn't really have a whole lot to offer that this other one doesn't, but it does have this requirement of this piece of hardware, which if you don't have, you simply won't be able to use. So now we are going to artificially draw a line in the sand and say, here's the date by which you must write a large check to go replace your IT infrastructure. But what if I don't want to do that? What if my computers work just well or work okay? Well, that doesn't matter. You need to go buy a new computer. And so I think there's a couple of options that companies will have here, right? One is option A, and the most obvious one is they already bought the computers that have a TPM chip in them. It's been around for a while. So if you're upgrading your computers on a 3-year cycle or a 5-year cycle, this likely isn't an issue for you. And they will just do their free upgrade to Windows 11. Life will go on. Their lives won't be really any worse for the wear. The second option is if you have hardware and you want to keep it and you don't have a budget for new hardware, I think those people, and there's actually an interesting write-up on this on the Register, which we'll have linked for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. They say, quote, how about a desktop Linux, which has become very usable nowadays, allowing users to repurpose the hardware that runs Windows 10 perfectly well. So you keep the computer that you already have, that already continues to work for you, and you just put a different operating system that isn't going to cut supports for you, and now you're able to continue on. And more, increasingly these days, how are applications being delivered? It's a Chrome app. It's a thing through a web browser. It's an app. And so those things don't necessarily need a lot from the system to run. They both mostly need a browser. And that does a couple of things, right? It gets all the nerds who have a particular product inside of the place that they're building their product, and then they simply deliver it to you over an agreed upon tunnel. In most cases, that's a web browser. And so that works well from the provider standpoint, and it works well from the consumer standpoint and or the business owner that needs to run that thing. But I guess, Steve, where I wanted to get your thoughts is, as a person who sees stuff day in and day out, particularly where cost is a big deal because it affects overscale, do you think that the direction that Microsoft is going with Windows 11 and continuing to push people into their own cloud even, do you think that's going to have a detrimental effect and people will look up and say, man, if I have to go buy all new computers, maybe I'll just buy Macs?
I'm not really sure about that. So there's a couple of things that I would want to weigh in on this. So I'm loath to be in the position to defend Microsoft. However, I do think that let's be honest, they are the world's largest operating system vendor. And at some point we've criticized them for holding too much legacy. And now when they're pushing the envelope, so to speak, and I don't even think they're pushing the envelope that much. Like you said, TPM chips have been around for some time. So it's not like it rolled out last year and now we're throwing, everything else in the trash. If the manufacturers of the hardware have decided to lag behind on the addition of the TPMs, they bear a bunch of the responsibility. When you're talking about attempting to increase the security and everybody across the board whips Microsoft for any problem that any software has as a vulnerability, right? Like the CrowdStrike thing, pick a number of things, right? Oh, Windows has enabled it, or Microsoft is somehow involved with it. And so when they're making a move to do something that is future-proofing is not exactly the right word, but moving, like a forward-moving thought, now we're whipping them because they're moving too fast. At what point do we give them a pass and say, you know what, it sucks for the end user. I get it. It's terrible from the perspective of like, my stuff is working, but they also they also should be allowed some latitude to decide when they are going to make a cutover like that, because we hold them in such responsibility across the world. So they need some level of latitude to be able to make a decision if we're going to hold them to this standard of like, hey, it's your fault that, 8 million computers around the world went crazy, even though it was software running on top of your operating system. And all these flights were grounded and stuff. If we're going to whip them over that, then we also have to give them some latitude to be able to actually fix those problems when it's time. So,
yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I think that where I am going to struggle with this is in the end, trying to sit down with business owners and get them to write checks and when I struggle to explain to them the difference that they're going to see in the day-to-day thing. Like what is the average threat that the business worker, the office worker faces that a TPM chip solves?
Well, I suppose that's an area where I would actually have to go myself and start looking into it if I was going to try and make that case. But at the same time, when you are a large organization, you can't run your business for the edge cases. And as much as that's offensive for people that are running small businesses and they feel like they're being left behind, when you're talking on the scale that Microsoft is running at, like at some point, somebody's going to be left behind, and you have to make that decision of like, when are we going to make this? It's very similar to trying to schedule downtime, right? You know that you're going to cause disruption in the business by taking some level of downtime. So you basically have to choose who are you going to disrupt and who is the least, who has the least seniority in terms of who you're going to interrupt on this chain.
So let me approach it from this perspective then. So if we are not seeing Microsoft's approach play out, and indeed StatsCounter's numbers put Microsoft, the flagship operating system, at half of the market share of its predecessor. So 11 has half the users that 10 does right now. Do we hope that we're waiting for system administrators to complete the upgrade to 11? Or do we think that Microsoft is up again? I would agree with you. It's a reasonable stance to take to say at some point we're going to turn off support for 32-bit systems. If it's still out there, it's not we hate people with 32-bit computers. It's just, come on, it's, today's date. We got to move on. If we allow that to happen, we allow the same Microsoft to make some of those same decisions. So if they got to pick a date and they're going to make that change, if this is the hill that we're going to split on, okay, does it seem like that might be an insurmountable hill for them to climb? That people will say, yeah, you know what, I don't have money for a new computer, so I'm either going to run Windows 10 into the ground, literally, and maybe further into the ground, or do we look at it and say, yeah, no, they might make a switch, Mac or Linux?
Yeah, the other thing that we are neglecting here, and again, I really don't like being in this defensive Microsoft kind of position, but from putting on the business hat, even a small business hat, like Windows 10 is almost 10 years old. At what point do we allow them to say, you know what? Even RHEL, we start cutting people off. It becomes, when you go into extended, what do we call it? EOL. When you go into the EOL phase, it's hey, these are critical bug fixes only sort of thing. You're getting no new features, and that is something that you have to pay for beyond the regular 10-year cycle, all that sort of stuff. So at what point are they allowed to drop support for Windows 10?
That's a great question. I think I would feel better about it if the promise with Windows 10 from the beginning hadn't been, hey, this is the last version of Windows 10, we're going to do it, or the last version of Windows, it's going to be like Mac, where, you keep getting the updates and we don't have these, major changes that you go. And in the end, both, Apple has their own brand of bad insofar as they make a cut, right? And so at a certain point, the operating system turns red, and that means that they're no longer supporting that version, and so they're not pushing updates for it. And if you got to go buy a new piece of hardware, that's even worse. In this case, this is the only time Microsoft has ever put a hardware thing in to say, hey, this is the time when you have to we got to make the change. So I guess to put a positive spin on this, the way that I look at this is there's a tremendous opportunity here. I think we had an opportunity when we made the change to Windows XP. I think we had another opportunity when we made the 7 to 10. And I think this represents maybe the largest opportunity in desktop Linux's history from the standpoint that if there is an opportunity, if there was a time to make a case for desktop Linux, now is the best time to make the case for desktop Linux. On one hand, you have the immutability thing going on, so a lot of the same selling points of Mac OS are now available on Linux. From the usability side, it's just gotten better because so many more apps are either Electron-based or available via Electron, or are just running on the web. And so as we continue to adopt that standard, and the nerds like it because, again, puts all their infrastructure over where they can control it and they can set it up, and they're not dealing with on-premise equipment that fell over because nobody wanted to touch it or play with it for 13 years, and you don't want to put money into something that's working, Steve. So we just don't. We let it fall over. That wasn't working for anybody. So this is kind of the best model where the customer provides their device, and whether that's a phone with an app on it or a computer or a Chromebook or a Linux desktop, that becomes the conduit by which the user receives service to the thing. And so if you look at how apps are being developed today, a lot of them, if they can, are running through the webs. And even the ones that are running local, a lot of those are running some sort of little local engine, and then they're transmitting up to a cloud-based service. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity in there. I think there's might be a tremendous opportunity in there for Endless West specifically, because as I'm watching first-time people play with it, I'm finding that it's so intuitive to them, and they're able to so quickly land on, hey, here's how I mirror this display. Hey, here's how I open this Office document. Here's how I open this web browser or do this thing. As I watch that play out, I look and I say, man, all of the stuff that's happening in the immutable space, all the things that's happening over in the opinionated distro space where they're trying to deliver niche solutions, I feel like the land looks bright going into the next few years. You think I'm too optimistic?
No, I think that there's definitely opportunity there. I think that in general, I don't really think that it's going to be a large tectonic shift. I think what will happen is the idea that people are used to phones and stuff like that will really help out in this regard, that people are used to using something that's not Windows. And so
Yes.
That has been a definite shift from the Windows 8 era. Yes, people had phones and stuff like that, but we're talking about like mass adoption and how now there are so many varieties, especially in the Android ecosystem, of phones that have different types of UIs, and people are just used to the fact that things just don't work in the exact way that they thought it did in Windows or whatever. So I think there's good potential there. I think that on one hand, we have a good ability to go out there and show that, hey, this thing that we like is privacy respecting and all the other good stuff about it. But oh yeah, it'll actually do what you need it to do. And I think that really is a positive note. I think that Microsoft gets a really bad rap. I see this thing. This is a symptom across the world in general. Okay. It's like whenever there's a side on anything, both sides look at it and highlight the worst thing, and both sides do it instead of just being like, let's take a beat and say, is this actually a reasonable thing? The Linux side is looking at this and going, oh, we're salivating, saying, haha, look at evil Microsoft doing this thing. They're abandoning support for Windows 10 and saying a Windows 11 is the only thing, is only going to support this certain hardware. But then when you actually start breaking it down logically and saying, well, wait a second, isn't it a decade old? Wait a second, shouldn't we be pushing forward with the security-minded stuff? Isn't that something we should do? And at what point should we do it? If it's not now, is it 20 years after the fact? How it becomes almost a chicken and the egg. If you don't have people requiring the use of the TPM chip, maybe it starts to go away, and it could have legitimately been a good force for security. But because we couldn't get people to use it, it kind of fades into the background. And so, yeah, I would like it if the world just kind of takes a beat every once in a while and saying, you know what, my knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, go my side. But how about thinking a little bit through this and saying, well, okay, what is actually reasonable for that? If my viewpoint says that side needs to change, well, the way to do it isn't to make them you, because you're never going to do that. The way to do that is to say, okay, well, what's reasonable? If I want you to change and we need to coexist, what is reasonable? What is a reasonable request from my point to you in solving this problem that I don't agree with?
I'll tell you exactly how I would approach that, Steve. I would suggest we simply water the plants as they want to water. So instead of focusing on, if I can take this analogy a little bit further, instead of spraying weed killer on the Microsoft weeds and trying to get rid of them and all that, water the flowers where they'll grow. And so when you see somebody or you see the opportunity, whether that's in your life with your family or your friend or the business that you have a part-time job or a full-time job with, and hey, we're going to go throw out all these computers. Well, what are we doing with those computers? Well, we're going to use them because we need this thing. And maybe the answer is, hey, we need this very specific piece of Windows software to run on it. Well, fine. Then maybe you're in that boat where we just need to do these. But could we take those computers? Could we reload them with something like Endless? And could we donate them to a school or an after-school club or a tech group around or a nonprofit that could use some computers, a library, those sorts of things? And I think you could use some of the decisions that are, again, maybe they're reasonable, maybe they're fine. It doesn't mean we can't use those things to our advantage and say, all right, let's water those plants. There's an opportunity here. Let's make sure something good grows. That's where we got to leave with music, and areas means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. We're here every Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com.